working for you. This is 23 News at 5.
The very definition of abortion was front and center Thursday in a federal trial over a state law that requires medical professionals to promote the procedure. 23 News reporter Jim Haggerty was in court and tells us why some think the First Amendment plays a role in this battle playing out in court.
According to attorneys who are fighting to stop the state law, there is a distinct difference between an elective abortion and when a pregnancy is ended because of a medical need.
Where you have to go in and take the baby to save the life of the mother, they don't see that as an abortion because there's a different intent. The doctor isn't intending to kill the child. The child dies as a result of an attempt to save the mother.
That's a situation doctors often find themselves in when pregnant women have medical emergencies and life-saving decisions must be made that result in the death of an unborn child. Lawyers fighting to stop an amendment to the Illinois Healthcare Right to Conscience Act say that those situations are not the same as an elective abortion and should not be regarded as such.
So there's a big difference between that and going in and intentionally killing the child.
Attorney Kevin Terrio is fighting to stop the state law from taking effect because he says it forces medical workers to offer abortion resources, which is a violation of the First Amendment.
The pregnancy centers to be able to live out their beliefs without being targeted by the government, and that's what's going on here.
Some state line residents who are following the case say while elective abortions are women's rights in Illinois, they are not the same as when a doctor makes a decision to end a pregnancy, even a viable one.
I think, and to save that lady's life, I think abortion would be okay.
Those in favor of the law argue that requiring doctors to provide abortion referrals is the same as doctors who refer pregnant patients with underlying medical issues to specialists who treat those conditions.
Thank you, Jim. And the law was passed in 2016, but it has not been enforced yet due to legal challenges.